Okay, and today's sponsor for today's monthly meeting is Temple, Winter Warbles. Here, I'm gonna let her come up and talk a little bit about Temple and all of that.
Well, I was just gonna comment.
But she's also the moderator, so she's Vice President of ITS Georgia. So she's also gonna moderate today's panel presentation. So go ahead and thank Temple.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for being here. I am trying to get an idea, so if you have any complaints about the drive or the facility, let me know, because we are hoping this is going to be a facility we can use in the future. It holds a lot of people and stuff like that. But first and foremost, thank you for being here. We've got a great panel, and I'm Winter with Temple. I work for Temple. If you need help with a project or any products, just call me. We'll see if we have a solution for you. And we'll kind of go from that route. I think most of you know who I am. So now I'm going to have the guys come up on the panel. Let's bring Andrew, Steve, and Brian up. Y'all go ahead and come up, and I'm going to just give a quick, brief bio for them, and then we're going to ask them to also, I guess it is. All right, where's Steve? There's Steve. All right, so we have Andrew Heath, has been with Georgia Department of Transportation for 8 years, serving in the Office of Planning and as the assistant to the chief engineer. He is a graduate of Auburn University with a Bachelor and Master's of Science in Civil Engineering. War Eagle, thanks for being here. All right, we have Steve here with over 25 years of experience in various engineering and management positions at intelligent transportation organizations and major car makers. He comes to global automakers after serving as Director of Public Policy for Vehicle Safety at General Motors. Steve has a strong track record working on both traditional, historical areas of auto safety and with emerging safety technology. He holds a BS from Kettering University and an MS from the University of Michigan. He serves on Mothers Against Drunk Driving National Board of Directors. And our third panelist is Brian Mulligan. He's the president and founder of Applied Information and has more than 18 years of experience leading the transportation industry in technical innovation. Brian established AI in 2011 to meet the need for a technology company that can apply new wireless Internet of Things, cloud computing, and connected vehicle technologies into modern solutions for the transportation sector. So just to begin, let's give them a round of applause for being here to talk to us about government and OEM, and it kind of goes along with the CAV, Connected Autonomous Vehicle Platform. One thing I want to start with is I want them to also give us some information on how they got into the CAV world. I'm going to kind of let you guys know where I came from, because things have changed so quickly and they keep changing, it's hard to keep up with this type of stuff. So almost 3 years ago, I got to experience my first autonomous car that you could actually pull off and drive, into traffic in the real world yourself. That was the first time I was in a Tesla. I was against autonomous cars at that point, and it was due to ignorance. I didn't really know what was going on in that world. I mean, we all sit here and talk about autonomous vehicles, and we have for so long, but getting in an autonomous shuttle and being on that where it's got its path and everything's mapped out is way different than getting in a car that you can actually allow the car to do, to drive for you, but also take over. I am a big believer in where we're going now with autonomous vehicles, and then even on the connected side, where I can quote someone as everything connected to everything will change everything. So that is, just something we need to be prepared for. And like I said, that was just 3 years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago for me, but 3 years is not a long time. And I honestly did not think we would have autonomous or connected vehicles as quick as I see it now. So over the past 3 years, I think it's just pulled me in, and I've been just wanting more and more information and watching it go really quickly. And fortunately, I work with a company and we represent products that allow us to stay involved in that. And so I'm excited to be the moderator on this panel and have these three here from government and OEM. So kind of a public-private type situation to discuss a lot of things that we all like to know. Now, real quickly, you'll have to put the microphone to your chin, basically. I don't know if anybody told you that. And then also, I have a lot of questions, and I've been told I have 2 hours worth of questions. So, and I am planning to give you guys, an opportunity to ask questions too. That's how excited I am. So let's be short and simple if we can. And if we want to go into more detail, y'all can do that. I'll give you guys all their cell numbers and y'all can call them personally. So first I want to start with you, Steve, and then move to Brian and then Andrew. What got you into the CAV world?
Sure. Hey, thanks a lot, Winter. I got into connected vehicles in a very unconnected way, I would say. And working at General Motors in their DC office, and then previously in Warren and Flint. When I was in DC, I worked with OnStar, and this was about 5 to 10 years ago, where it was really, a first good stab at connecting consumers and vehicles together for a variety of convenience and safety features. So that's kind of how I got connected into connected vehicles. And as Winter said, it's amazing to see the progress and how quickly automated vehicles and automated vehicle technology has come to the fore so quickly. I think back to some of the regulations we were working on with NHTSA as an industry and as a company 10 years ago. Was focused on crash worthiness, which we benefit from today with numerous airbags, crash worthiness, protecting occupants well, electronic stability control. At that time, no one was even thinking about having to deal with removal of controls, how vehicles can talk with one another. We were so focused on updating crash avoidance and crash worthiness features that the whole AV space, there's been disruptors, right? We've seen it with Waymo, to a certain degree with Tesla, a number of other companies, including Uber and Lyft, that are really pushing the envelope to see what we could get out there and as quickly we can do it. The challenge is, and what as global automakers, we're a trade association in DC, what we're focused really on is the safety opportunity that these technologies are going to provide. If fully autonomous AVs are a little further out in the future, I'm okay with that if we can make sure they're connected, and some of the technologies we're getting with automated vehicle development can help today's drivers and drivers of tomorrow that are going to be buying cars and pushing those technologies into vehicles. So a little bit of the background, but I think Winter's point is a good one. The technology is developing at such a rapid pace. It's taken some people by surprise, and it's disruptive, but there's a huge safety opportunity that we really need to leverage. Thanks.
All right, Brian, your turn. How did you get into the CAV world?
Well, I'd like to thank Andrew for giving me a mic. I thought when I didn't have a mic, I thought that wasn't an accident. I thought it was part of the plan. So I'm here, in fact, in two capacities. The first one is obviously with Applied Information, local Georgia technology company, looking to make a difference with private sector initiatives, starting off with an Internet of Things approach. There are 200 million of these radios already in your cars. So let's use those was the idea, to connect to the infrastructure. And what's going to save the lives is not the radios. What's going to save the lives is the application. And so let's get the applications in the car, start learning about applications. And that's what we pioneered, as most of you know, with our Travel Safety app, which is a free download to support the infrastructure. And I'd like to call out Marietta, and Ronnie from Marietta, who's the first early adopter who believed in our vision, and I'd like to give them props for supporting us in getting this out into 200 devices in Marietta. The second way I got involved in this is through NEMA. NEMA is the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. The transportation section is responsible for the TS2 standards, the TS4 standards, the TS5, and the new TS8 standard, the security standard, which is a standards development approach to be able to try and provide standards in this environment. And I happen to be chair of the transportation section, and in that way trying to lead the standards development operation as well to make these connected vehicles a reality.
All right, Andrew, your turn.
Thanks, Winter, and thanks for having me here this afternoon. I am involved in the connected automated vehicle space out of necessity. Working for the Georgia DOT, the promise of CAVs and the safety benefits of them is something we can't ignore. When you see those statistics that 95% of fatal crashes are as a result of driver behavior or the driver doing something incorrect on the roadway, and that CAVs can step into that space and prevent some of that, we are not at liberty to just ignore that and to let that and to let this happen without our input or without our involvement. The Office of Traffic Operations, we are responsible for positioning the state DOT in this space, for taking the lead from a policy perspective, from a project perspective, as to where we want to go in this space. And again, we feel like we want to be not quite at the bleeding edge, but at the leading edge, just a little bit behind that. Let's take proven technology and get it out there on the roadways and start to try to attract partners, be it the private sector or other third parties, to take advantage of it, to deploy this technology, and to take advantage of it, to start realizing those safety benefits immediately.
Awesome. Well, that leads me into my first question. Thank you, Andrew. So, Andrew, as short as you can give us, because I'm sure you can give us a very long detail of it, what is the public policy regarding CAV in Georgia to date?
We do not have a policy. We operate under state law. There is state law on the books from an AV perspective that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which we're quite happy with right now. It allows automated vehicles on Georgia roadways. It does not require any, what I would call cumbersome requirements for AVs to be there. And it falls under existing licensure, registration type requirements that currently exist within Georgia. From a connected, so that's where we operate on the AV side. From the connected side, again, we fall under the mantra of don't be on the bleeding edge, but be right behind it. That means we want to be an early adopter. We want to deploy connected vehicle technology. We were an early agency to answer the AASHTO SPAT challenge, which was us sort of declaring, hey, we're ready to do something here in Georgia. We continue to deploy now to continue to push that message across the country, really, that come to Georgia, we want to explore this technology, we want to attract partners. This is not us trying to put a stake in the ground saying, hey, we only care about this one specific type of technology, but really more so us saying we want to be in this game. We want third parties to come here, we want them to take advantage of our roadways, take advantage of our assets, of our information, to get this technology deployed and get it deployed quickly across the state of Georgia.
Very nice. Steve, with your background, I want to see if you have any input on how Georgia, I'm assuming you've been in the public policy side. What could you suggest for us to even make things better?
Hey, and I just want to build upon what Andrew said, and I think it's exactly right. I think it's good for states to encourage testing and to be looking at new technology. We deal with some states that are looking to be very prescriptive on the design of vehicles. Georgia hasn't done that. We think that's a really good thing to do, but it's very important for entities, companies that are testing automated vehicles to be working with state and local officials so they're knowledgeable of what's going on. As far as connected vehicles are concerned, I think it should be the policy of every state and local DOT to continue to support folks like ITS America and your own dealings through your state DOT to make sure the FCC is going to be preserving the full spectrum for the auto safety spectrum, the safety spectrum 5.9 gigahertz. We think that's really important that we make sure, regardless of what technology is ultimately deployed, that those 7 channels for V2V, V2X, V2I are preserved so we can innovate and deliver safety ultimately to our transportation system.
Brian, do you have anything on the public policy just yet, or can I move on? Okay, thank you. I knew that could get even bigger. So, Andrew, you mentioned you guys were one of the first to achieve the SPAT challenge. Now that you have achieved the SPAT challenge, what's the next steps? What's being discussed in GDOT?
So we're continuing to deploy connected vehicle technology through DSRC. Right now, we've moved beyond the initial 54 locations to upwards of 150 some odd locations and envision fully connecting the entire RTOP network across Metro Atlanta. And a lot of that is sort of that concept of if you have a technology that only works in one specific location, well, that's kind of an interesting little toy or gadget that you could have. But how realistic is that across an entire region, or to be fully adopted within vehicles? So that's the approach of, well, let's tackle this from a regional perspective and see if that tilts the conversation a little bit even further. So we're continuing to deploy on that front. Our next phase, what we call it, our phase 2 is multifaceted in that we also want to start bringing partners in, right? So we want to be able to stand up our platforms to say, hey, look, this is available, whether it's a local government, whether it's an OEM or some other private sector third-party company like Applied Information, say, how can we work together? Knowing here's what GDOT has. We have these base platforms through our Signal software, through what we're doing with our DSRC deployment, through our ATMS, through other platforms that we've got. How can we make this available for you guys to take advantage of that, to use that, build off of it, start developing local applications that make sense for your community, right, for what you're trying to achieve at your level. And that's where we want to position ourselves, is really to attract people into Georgia to start taking advantage of what we have to offer.
Next question is, and anyone who feels inclined to start on this one can. We have been talking about connected vehicles for more than 20 years. 2005 was the original target deployment date. Why have we not got it done, and what can be done?
Okay, so I think that representing the auto industry is probably a natural question I would jump into. Let me say, and I had touched on in my introductory comments, that so what has the auto industry been doing? I'd say in the last 12 to 15 years, the traveling public is benefiting from all the crash worthiness and crash avoidance features we talked about. And at the same time, there was standards development for rolling out V2X. We saw at the end of the last administration a proposal, an NPRM, to mandate the technology. The current administration's taking a technology neutral approach. So that's bringing some uncertainty to deployment. We've had some companies like GM and Toyota that have made announcements. GM has some vehicles that are out there with DSRC technology, so it's a great opportunity to continue to test and get experience. But I think there's a challenge here that we have on the government and the OEM side, is how do we provide certainty to the industry so we can deploy? We can use the full 7 channels, maximize the amount of safety applications. So I think the technology neutral approach, while certainly understandable, is giving some uncertainty to the industry of exactly how and when to deploy, and for you all that are responsible for deploying connected devices in local communities and for traffic management systems, that becomes a question too. But I don't think we should use it as an excuse not to deploy DSRC. You can deploy DSRC today. At CES, we heard an announcement from Ford that they intend to get into the spectrum and seek using C-V2X within the spectrum. We're encouraged by that, but I think we also need to work as an industry to come up with a plan for using the spectrum and deploying. But the bottom line is we need to make sure we're protecting the spectrum of the full 7 channels.
Okay, so I hear you say there's dust, noise, and confusion with not having a mandate now. But again, we were supposed to turn this around in 2005. So the mandate just started with the new administration. So, and I've seen a lot of stuff happen over the past 3 years. So maybe Brian or Andrew, do you guys have any information on a lot of things have happened over the past 3 years, even without this mandate? Yes, there's dust, noise, and confusion. Again, how do we get connected autonomous vehicles out there to bring forth the safety applications? I mean, that's what we're looking for. No matter what communication it is, whether it's radio, cell, what have you. How are we going to do that?
Yeah, the mic, I'd like to first go to that. I'd like to answer that in a couple of ways. There's a great example of a technology deployment, 2 technology deployments in our generation that's transformed our life. The first one is the internet. The second one is cell phones, these things. Neither of those required a mandate. Neither of those required the government to regulate how the private sector did them. Both of those were done with the private sector taking the lead. And that's what we're, somewhat in this awkward space of not quite being a supplier, as Andrew's, the discussions that we've had, we're not quite a supplier, we're not quite a software person, we're sort of something of a solutions provider, a red-headed stepchild in the whole business of how the transportation business has traditionally bought assets. But what that leads you to the point where you can actually proceed with confidence. First of all, the interoperability of all these systems. Great model lies in the messages and not in the radios. AT&T and Verizon use different radios. iPhone and Android use different operating systems. The answer is it doesn't matter. The private sector will sort that out. We'll figure that out. What you've got to do is focus on what you agree on and not what you don't agree on. And so what the industry agrees on, the automakers, AT&T, for example, just submitted a comment in response to the USDOT's request that they're equipping 500,000 cars a month with radios right now. They're 4G LTE radios, and they work just fine. So our challenge as an industry is how do we move beyond this discussion about just imagine the future when we've all got new radios to let's start deploying with the radios we got and then embrace the radios that are coming in the future. And that's led us to deploy, as most of you know, more than 10,000 of these devices in over 500 cities. So this approach of deploying the radios we already have is resulting in a competitive landscape that the private sector can respond to with delivering solutions instead of just product.
Well, yes, you
Yeah,
can.
I just want to add one quick thing to that. Going back, you mentioned this has been discussed since 2005, so we've been talking about this now for almost 15 years. And I think as part of that weight, you're seeing governments get almost anxious about this conversation. And I think that, and for those of you in the public sector in the room, you probably know, you get that feeling from what I'm talking about, like we should be doing something from a CAV perspective. And I think that's what created the SPAT challenge, right? That was the government standing up saying, hey, we're ready to do something, right? We've been talking about this forever. We've been going to conferences. We've been sitting in rooms, talking about what we're going to do, all these standards, these conversations. Well, let's get it on the ground and start doing something to hopefully get people deploying, whether it's DSRC, whether it's 4G LTE, whether it's 5G, what have you. Let's start realizing the benefits of this technology and getting it on the ground, right? I think you're seeing government get to that point that, even government as slow as we are, we're there. Let's do it. Let's realize the benefits of this technology. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that leads us into, so if we all have a focused goal to deploy now and save lives now, we can all say we want to save lives, the applications, safety applications, I think we can all agree with that. I'm hearing that up here amongst you three. How do we do that? How can the government, and OEMs work together? How do we promote collaboration and become partners in this, within the CAV world? And I know these are a lot of questions, so you guys can kind of answer how you want to. And also, what can we agree on? What does the public sector have to offer, and what does the private sector have to offer with this collaboration and everything? How can we make it happen?
I'll quickly weigh in that we see our role as really an empowerment type role for the OEMs or for the private sector. We have a lot of assets. We've got 18,000 miles of right-of-way within Georgia. There are 10,000 traffic signals in Georgia. We collect and push a tremendous amount of information that can be made available. We want to make all of those assets readily available to OEMs, to the private sector, to take, as I said, to take advantage of, to stand up this technology, right? So we want to empower the industry to do that. We don't want to pick winners or losers or anything like that, but if we can get the industry positioned through the platforms we already have to build off of that, start developing applications, to deploying technology, that's what we see as our primary role. Our efforts to date in deploying technology are to try to encourage that conversation, to establish platforms to show that, hey, we're in this conversation, we're ready to do something, and we can build off of this to further deploy across the state. So that's where I see where Georgia can come in this conversation to help the proliferation of CAV technology.
Yeah, my perspective, as being a trade association guy, and my perspective over my experience is that the world is run by people who show up. And it's time for us in this industry to show up. And what I mean, for example, ITS Georgia, this association, all these people here, the board here, why don't you convene a workshop, a connected and autonomous vehicle workshop, with Andrew as the guy who's got the traffic assets, to come up with what's Georgia's private sector, public sector plan for cooperation, so that we together or collaborating. We talk about collaboration in meetings like this, and then we go back to our silos and we forget how to do that. So what it's needed is organizations like this and people like this and people who are prepared to show up to say, let's try and push this forward and make this happen in 2019. It's not some just imagine the future and let's see what we can get done. This collaboration is possible if we all just show up.
I would add, obviously, there's a technology discussion going on within the industry. You have DSRC, you have CV2X. They're looking to use the same spectrum. So I think, to build off Andrew and Brian, the industry working with local partners and the government needs to figure out how best to use that spectrum. Now, there's some restrictions right now. DSRC is the only technology allowed in this band. We're talking 75 megahertz and 5.9 gigahertz. So the FCC will likely have to do a rulemaking at some point to address that issue. But we're very much about trying to innovate in this space and work with the industry to drive to a solution. When you have multiple technologies that are looking to use that spectrum, OEMs want to make sure, as you folks do when you deploy technology, that it's going to be useful, that the spectrum's going to be available, that's going to be free from interference. There's interference testing that's going on now by DOT and the FCC. So these are important factors as well. And yeah, is it delaying deployment? It is, the uncertainty is, but I think it's a challenge for all of us as stakeholders. As Brian said, you know, the world belongs to those who show up, to really get down to brass tacks and figure out how to solve these problems.
Well, you just led me into you guys are doing great. Y'all are really roleplating really well here with my questions I have. So we are talking about the radio wars now. There is this thing that we have put so much focus on, and we shouldn't. The private sector is going to figure it out for us. The radio wars is talking about DSRC, 4G, 5G. So this is where I'm going to ask. There are now CV2X and 5G, which is the public, challenging DSRC for spectrum and dominance. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? How does this affect the public and private partnership we are trying to build? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to jump in on that. So I think the data is going to be important. I know that the folks that are advocating for CV2X are developing test data. We need to look at, understand what's the maximum opportunity. Is there a benefit for a deployment scenario from one against the other? So I think it's really important to understand the data. So as you folks deploy out in the traffic management space and in cities and state DOTs, you want to make sure that the technology you're putting out there is going to be efficient, what it does, providing the services, and being able to innovate. And I keep going back to the fact that if DSRC is the only technology allowed in the band today, the FCC needs to get engaged, and we need to figure out how best to use the spectrum. Maybe the spectrum gets split between the two technologies. We don't know ultimately what that's going to be like, but if that's the case, we don't want a DSRC-equipped device or vehicle not to be able to communicate with a CV2X equipped vehicle. So these are some of the questions that are hard to answer, but we really need to work together to find what the answers are and deploy this technology.
So I don't think it's a bad thing. You know, we talked about waiting for the last 15 years. I think with this conversation going on of technology and which one's going to win out, that's going to create an environment where 15 years from now, I certainly hope we're not sitting around having the same conversation of when is anybody going to do anything. I think it's going to spur the question of, okay, what ultimately is going to win out and deploy. But I think going back to our earlier conversation, it's not worth waiting, right? You know, from a government side, you hear a lot of hesitancy and anxiety of what should I be doing because nobody has the 127 steps to deploying a connected vehicle state. That doesn't exist. So that creates anxiety on our end and uncertainty. But when you compare the cost of connected vehicle technology compared to the concrete and steel that's being put into place down there at 2D5400, we're talking about pennies. I mean, it's absolutely nothing compared to our traditional costs of asphalt and concrete. So it's not super high risk for us. So let's go ahead and deploy. Whether if some of our technology is throwaway, well, that's okay. We can adapt and move on, right? We can take advantage of what's out there now and realize some benefits now. You know, or we could come up with a radio that has both chipsets in it. We can, have both DSRC and 5G, and then, we're moving forward. So, I think that, again, it's not worth waiting in that conversation. I think that ultimately that radio war conversation is really going to help push this technology, because people aren't going to wait at that point.
Yeah, I'd like to support what Andrew says, because there's a great model for us all to look back on in how we've done this before. And that was how the cell phone business dealt with 2G. When we started deploying Internet of Things devices out in the transportation space, they were all 2G. Who remembers that? Then it became 3G. Then it became 4G, LTE, Cat 1, Cat 4, and so forth. All of these things happened behind the scenes that all our deployment customers didn't even know about. So that the business of focusing on the radios as a reason not to do anything just leads us to a bad situation. If the government authorities choosing to buy radios as a procurement model can deal with that by saying these radios need to be upgradable to 5G and cellular VTEC sometime in the future and have over-the-air software updates to deal with whatever protocol changes happen in the future. There's procurement ways of dealing with this today, which means that we can confidently deploy and get on with actually deploying stuff that actually works. And get into the exciting part of this conversation with what are the applications? What are these things that are going to do? I mean, I was in California and there was a great sign outside a school that I passed and it said, school zone, 25 miles an hour when children are present. And I thought to myself, how's an autonomous vehicle going to figure that out? What does that mean? And then I found it's not just some aberration, but every school zone in the state of California says that. Well, there's a huge application challenge for us as transportation professionals to sort out. And let's get going with that, because that's a great example of keeping the children safe in school buses and whatnot that don't require us to solve the radio wars problem.
All right, I'm gonna try to route my questions up so I can get to you, but did you get to do? You went first, right? Okay, I just wanna make sure. So Andrew's talked a lot about anxiety, and yes, I mean, not having that 120-step process that we as engineers like to check off, it would be nice, but it's not that way. So where have you, all of you, seen the dust, noise, and confusion, which obviously leads to fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that happens? I mean, how can the government and OEMs as partners work together to eliminate some of that? Because what I'm finding is you'll hear things and we'll just believe it. I mean, that's kind of like the news these days. We'll just believe it and we'll assume that that's true, but it's really not. There's other things. I mean, obviously, these autonomous shuttles and stuff, when there's an incident, when a pedestrian gets hit, that is going to throw it back a lot. How many pedestrians actually get hit every day that we're not talking about? I mean, that's the stuff that we see. We see all this in the news where they just really, and then it sets us back again and puts that fear, uncertainty, and doubt and just stirs it. Where do you see that and maybe kind of letting them know what the facts are, that they've heard, the latency, the safety applications? I mean, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of dust, noise, and confusion that has happened with that we just assume people are telling the full truth about. So if y'all could give some instances on that, I think that would help, provide information to this group so they can go out and also help with this CAV world and try to help with the fear that is around us about it.
Sure. I would say that, as Andrew's been talking about, I mean, let's deploy, right? So I think the more deployment we have out there of roadside infrastructure that the industry can talk to is going to be really beneficial. But I would say that as well, there's, so we replace phones quite often, right? We don't replace cars quite as often. So, that's why there's uncertainty of exactly what to deploy and when. But there really should be a challenge. I think you overcome the dust and the noise with leadership. And I really think there's need for leadership here that the industry can provide, but I think we also need certainty from the FCC. There's talk about taking the spectrum away. So we spent a lot of time in making sure to try to convince the folks in DC that's a really bad idea, because no matter what the technologies, we're not going to be able to deploy. So I think it comes from leadership, challenging folks at DOT, which we do in a very constructive way. I think we've made progress in having them advocate for the full spectrum. And we're meeting today with the FCC, my staff, members of my staff, and my colleagues colleagues are meeting with new commissioners to make sure we're going to retain the spectrum, because we're not going to be able to deploy if we lose it to Wi-Fi. So that's why the testing's important, but I think it really gets down to leadership at all levels. As Andrew's saying, if there's deployment here in Georgia, that's going to be really important for our industry to engage with and to build upon. So those are just some thoughts I had. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo that, and hopefully that's where GDOT can fill that role here in Georgia and really kind of serve as a risk mitigation for locals that are looking to deploy or looking to get this technology out there. You know, just to echo Winter's point, you know, I don't know the exact number, but I think we're north of 250 fatalities in Georgia, and we're, what, March 25th? Is it March 25th? You know, 3 to 4 people a day, and everyone accepts that, you know, but from an AV perspective, when there was a fatality in Phoenix, or I think it was Phoenix, right?
Yeah.
You know, the whole industry came to a grinding halt and said, oh my gosh, we better back up and see what happened and you know, restart and take a look at this. Well, meanwhile, every day goes by here in Georgia, it's 3 to 4 people. So we need to, you know, we need to move, and we need to move now. But again, yeah, going back to the leadership point, I think that's critical. You know, we got to have leadership across the spectrum, from governments to OEMs to private sector, saying we're all marching to the same drum beat, we're all moving together to get this out there, and I think that's really how it comes to fruition.
I've got 2 contributions to make. The first one goes to the issue of collaboration. It's easy to talk about, but it's hard to do because we're so used to going back into our silos. So I'd like to say that this is something that ITS Georgia, when this, I remember hearing from one of the old timers who said ITS Georgia was established to advocate for technology. It wasn't to be a networking club. And I think that there's an argument to say that somewhat we've we've transitioned into being a networking club and lost sight a little bit of advocating for technology. So this is something that the society can do, is advocate for technology within Georgia. It's part of what we do. There's some specific things we can do in that area. The second thing is when it comes to standards. Standards don't have to be a long and complicated process. There can be a standard for deploying connected vehicles in Georgia. A stakeholder meeting is convened by the Georgia Department of Transportation with interested parties to workshop for a day of what that standard should look like and how should we participate in the public and private sector to achieving a common vision of connected vehicles in Georgia. It would be the kind of idea that this society could advocate for as having a small imperfect standard that turns us into collaborators instead of just suppliers and consultants and software folks. So that's what I'm advocating for the RTS Georgia, Mrs. Vice Chair.
In picking up on what Andrew said about our complacency for accepting deaths on our roads, and it's really something that I know all of you are very concerned about, we're concerned about in the auto industry. We lose 10,000 people a year to alcohol-impaired driving. Half of our fatalities on our roads are unbelted. I don't have to talk to this community about speeding in our country as well. But when we have new technology, you had mentioned the crash in Arizona. We have other crashes that are involving some high-profile AV-type early technology that we've seen. We need to learn from them. That's the most important thing. We need to be able to learn what happened in these situations and apply it quickly. So there's often a pushback on the technology, but I think if we're working as an industry together with the investigative units within government to understand what's happening in these crashes, we're going to be able to help advance the technology. But I think there's other technologies on impaired driving that we need to look at as well, because those are more immediate concerns. But I think it's an ongoing challenge for our country that we actually tolerate, if you will, a consistent level of fatalities. And it's a cultural thing for our country, and I think our communities also have to buy into, it's difficult, speed enforcement, high visibility drunk driving enforcement, those are going to be important as well. And that will also help us envision a future with technology, but we have to learn from our mistakes. That's the most important thing from these events that we take away from them. We have to learn them quickly, and it needs to be done in a transparent manner as well. Thank you.
Well, and I'll just add a few things to that. You know, some of the things, like I said, I listen to I try to stay up to date as much as I can. It's very difficult. But, you know, I get what you're saying. We have to learn from that. The great thing is typically with these connected autonomous vehicles, we get to learn from it. That information is right there. So it shouldn't, one, take that much time, because when we see that there's an intersection that has high pedestrian incidents, high crashes, or what have you, we as engineers have to go collect the data, get it from, fortunately Georgia has gears and stuff, and we have to put all that together to figure out what needs to happen at that intersection. So again, that's where I just want to make sure this dust, dust, noise, and uncertainty, doubt happens. When you look at how many pedestrians have died from an autonomous shuttle based on how many we kill driving our own cars every day, it's, I mean, you can't even compare it. When you look at the 40,000 people that die on the road, I know I'm getting into the safety side, and I know a lot of you are probably wanting to snooze, but when you look at the 40,000 people that die on the road every year on our roads, and we're traffic engineers, we're the ones designing them, we're the ones who are supposed to be bringing transit together, autonomous vehicles together, and that's what we're doing. So I just, you know, that's what I'm hoping, you know, this panel is showing you from 3 different perspectives, that it is going fast. There's a lot of, you know, back and forth. The spectrum, he has mentioned the spectrum. Most everyone, my understanding, when there was just to let y'all kind of know, when there was comments and questions requested, the spectrum, most everyone wants to save the spectrum, but they also do not want to be told what kind of radio to use. So yes, saving the spectrum seems to be at the top of a lot of people's priority, but trying to figure out how we're going to communicate from intersections to vehicles to people and things like that, that's where especially the private sector has requested for, you know, and thankfully the government's not mandating that, so they're allowing the private sector to kind of come in. With that, are there any questions from the audience?
Hey, I just had a question. We hear a lot about the problems, you know, with implementing, and certainly in the media, some of the issues with the technology, but is there any, I was wondering if there's any successes that y'all have seen from really any perspective that you could share.
Very quickly, I'll say a success is that we have deployed connected vehicle technology and it works on our roadways. Didn't take very long. We got it from RFP to on the ground and operating, I think within 9 months. So it was not a tremendous lift to do that. For the folks in the room that worked on that, I apologize for making it sound that simple. I know it wasn't. But it can be done, right? I mean, you know, if anybody wants to get together and stand up a connected vehicle deployment, you can do it. Brian and his folks, when they stand things up using their cell technology, they do it within a matter of days, right? So it's not a complicated thing. So I think those successes are ready and apparent, right? So quickly answer your question, yeah, there have been successes.
Yeah, and I could go down to even more specific again with our friends at Marietta, who the early adopters, and the first connected vehicle application, their focus was to get paramedics to citizens in need. Based on mining the data in Marietta, because we've got, you know, you used to know some of the things about some of the things some of the time, but with everything connected to everything, you know everything about everything all the time. So mining the data, the average paramedic in Marietta travels through 5 traffic intersections on his way to an incident. And the average, that reduces the transit time to an incident by a minute. The research shows that if we save those lives by getting paramedics, people in need, a minute earlier, the potential is to save 9,000 lives in Georgia a year. Yeah, connected vehicles works, and it works today. That's an example.
I would just echo my fellow panelists here, and we know connected vehicle technology can be beneficial, and it works through the various deployments that we've seen already and the testing we've seen. As an industry example of working voluntarily, by 2022, all light vehicles will have automatic emergency braking installed. So that's outside of regulation, and that's a terrific technology. It helps you avoid crashes, right? So we know crash avoidance is working. We know the technologies are bringing benefits for safety. If we can now use connected vehicle technology to inform those vehicle-based sensors even more, I think we're going to be in a great position. So I think we're seeing the beginning of crash avoidance benefits And I think you're only going to see even more benefit of integrating that information into existing vehicle-based systems to help avoid more crashes. So we know the technology works for connected vehicles, we've seen that. Now there's an opportunity to integrate all of these sensing technologies, whether it's LiDAR, radar, and connected vehicle technology to help avoid crashes. Because when you're in a dynamic crash environment, when you have vehicles out on the road moving quickly, milliseconds do count. Whether you avoid the crash or not, you want to take velocity out of a crash scenario, as all of you well know. So these technologies will help us do that.
This question is kind of for everybody, I think. We've been talking a lot about the deployment itself, and as Brian and Andrew both pointed out, the deployment itself is actually fairly simple and becoming very successful. I think the bigger challenge is I don't foresee drivers downloading different apps that they already have on their phone and running, say, a Google Maps at the same time as some CV app. And I think that the solution is getting into apps that they already have. But from what I understand, Google has so much data, they charge you to give them your data. What are you guys seeing in terms of apps that people already have on their phones integrating this CV technology?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, Waze is starting with a program to provide those open portals, and we're participating in some of those programs. So what you have to do, though, from the infrastructure side is get critical mass that Google and Waze pay attention. And that's what we've got to do. And just the business of having a separate app is just an interim step to some more integrated apps. That's the way I believe it's going to unfold. Well, and again, the business about getting it into the dashboard. First of all, it came through the various open interfaces that the new car dashboards are having, like Ford Sync and so forth. You can get those now on the dashboard. You can get it combined to do audible alerts behind your navigation system. So it's all moving forward, but we've got to start with steps. We're not going to start with the end. And it's all going to then migrate into how the customers actually want it.
Yeah, I think that's where partnering with the OEMs and manufacturers is ultimately to get it into the dashboard. So it's part of the vehicle at that point.
And on that point, actually, you talked about the long life of the vehicle. But if NHTSA wanted to do anything, it would be to mandate that the connected vehicle technology should be a plug-in module that's replaceable on an easy, changeable basis, so that even though the vehicle's going to last 20 years, the CV module might be changed every 3 years. There are ways of dealing with that kind of thing.
This kind of goes back to fact. Getting this panel together, I want to thank Andrew first for that. We will get to other questions, but I did get to watch a panel he was on at the Consumer Electronics Show, which sounds like a fantastic show, and we should all go next year. So in Las Vegas at that, engineers in Vegas, it should be fun. But one thing that was brought up, and you might help me with this, Andrew, is I think it was Michigan, and maybe you know, Steve, the University of Michigan, or they did a study, and what they found is, everybody thinks it's got to be deployed in everybody's phone, or it's got to be, but what they have found with the study is that it can, anywhere from 10 to 15% of penetration can allow those cars to move a platoon through. So we don't need that much. I mean, 10 to 15%, that's not a high number. So this thought of we've got to have 75% of people downloading apps or it being in the car, it's all in dashboards. Yes, we're all taking care of that, but we need the infrastructure to get there. So that while in the background all that's being taken care of, to get that 10 to 15% to actually see something happen, I just think that would, that's what we need to focus on also.
There was another question.
I just had a question about the security aspects to make sure people don't do a hostile takeover or other kind of damaging things using this technology.
So I think, obviously, cybersecurity is something we're living with day to day for the rest of our lives, right? The folks that will replace us all will be dealing with cybersecurity as well, whether it's traffic management systems, connected vehicle systems. There's a constant challenge. The auto industry has an automotive ISAC, where it's an experience sharing It's a learning opportunity to do in a secure setting, so OEMs and suppliers can talk to one another to understand potential threats, how they're addressed. But I think that's an ongoing challenge that we're going to have as an industry, that every industry will have, and it's going to be an ongoing part of our work. And the most important thing is, like, we're learning from specific crashes. We need to be learning from each other, and the industry set up a mechanism to do that, of vulnerabilities from a cyber standpoint. And I think connected vehicles will be able to be addressed, autonomous vehicles will be able to be addressed, because you have to address those things if you're going to deploy those technologies.
Yeah, security is just one of the key ways that people create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And again, it has to be addressed, but I'm going to give you an example against myself. The one thing that I knew I would never do on the internet is banking. I mean, it's clearly a silly thing. That how could you possibly make the internet secure enough that you can do banking? And the answer is we all do banking. And because it just shows how little I knew about it when it came to actually practically very smart folks deploying standards to deploy technology in one environment which can spill over to the other environments. When we first got cell phones, the business of people sniffing in on other people's calls, you heard about that 20 years ago. You never hear about it anymore. And the reason being is there are a couple of simple principles of standards and over-the-air software update that allows you to secure these networks. And the same will apply in this space. And I just want to give a shout out for the folks at NEMA and the surface transportation industry who got together and wrote a standard called NEMA TS8, which is Cyber and Physical Security for Intelligent Transportation Systems. It was a private sector-led initiative where we just showed up and wrote a standard. Go and download it, it's about 40 pages. It'll show you how we can do security in the transportation space.
Good. All right. So one thing I did find out this morning, and I should have upgraded for you iPhone users. Apparently there was an update last night that I said skip. I think it was like basically an upgrade for 50. It was security bugs. So just to let y'all know, y'all might want to get that update tonight if you didn't get it last night, because it apparently is there. It's helping with the Facebook issue that happened, which I'm not even sure what happened with that. But it's basically dealing with some of those security things. So there again, over-the-air software updates, future-proofing. They're not having to go to every phone and give it a software update. It is based at our convenience. So that's something we need to think about as we move in the technology side also. Next question. And guys, I know it's past 1, so if you do need to leave, understand completely. We will be wrapping up in the next 15 minutes for sure.
So I know you guys have had some discussion recently about the pedestrian accidents, mainly the one that happened in Arizona. I'm just kind of curious to know if there's been any lessons learned from the recent airplane crashes that have occurred with the Boeing MAX 8 737s, and what can that be implemented? Because there's been certainly that concern of like that can cause some pushback in the CAV industry. So I'm just curious to know what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think, we have a Department of Transportation that has all the modes, right? Highway, FMCSA, FAA, NHTSA. There's an opportunity to kind of learn as tasks are being automated. How do you do that safely? We also have the National Transportation Safety Board. We've talked to former members of that board to understand what are the learnings from aviation that we can apply to the driving environment. Two totally different modes, obviously, but there's got to be some learnings, right? So I think what we're seeing with a lot of the companies, at least that what Global Automakers is representing, is how do we assist the driver? We're going to make sure the driver remains in the loop. There's ways to do that, where you have the automated technology assist the driver in what it's doing. But I think there's a real human factors opportunity to understand how do you have drivers and operators understand what they're using. What I tell people that are curious about these types of things now is the vehicles on the road today, the driver is in full control. And it's important for, as OEMs execute automated technology, whether it's assisting the driver, they're assisting the driver right now. The driver is still responsible. So that's an important distinction that I think everyone in transportation needs to make. But I think we'll be learning from all modes of how drivers are responding to automated technology. And I think we look to folks like DOT, academic institutions, the National Transportation Safety Board, to have those learnings across modes.
Yeah, I think there's some great lessons to be learned out of the 737 MAX. Every indication is that it's just a classic software bug. It's a failure mode effect and criticality analysis that a use case didn't come up in their testing of a failure of an angle of attack sensor, which caused unexpected behavior of an automatic control system that pilots didn't know how to disconnect. So, but the lesson from that, never mind the detail of what happened to the planes and the tragedy that it is, it's an example that in this technology world, it shows that there's no alternative except to design, deploy, correct, and iterate. And just constantly go through that process. The business of waiting not to do anything until it's perfect at some time in the future. You ended up with these statistical corner cases that you just, no matter how sophisticated the FAA and Boeing were, they got a corner case that they just didn't realize. Tesla, and you know, was a company drive these things, they've had a number of corner cases that they didn't see. Andrew experienced a corner case on Friday when we were driving autonomously down the road, and it just took off into a gap in the traffic that wasn't there. So nonetheless, but what it does is it shows that there's a potential role for, in the technology space, for GDOT or the government broadly, to be in the regulatory and oversight role, and for the safely, for the private sector, to develop, innovate, iterate, and repeat that cycle and over. So I think that's the lesson out of the 737.
And we'll do one more question. The other thing is too, that's really awesome, is when we had that instance with Andrew. Sorry about that, Andrew. That was frightening for me too. But you know, so basically Brian took over the car, and in that moment when he took over the car, there was a video that was taken, so that it can go back to Tesla, they can review it and see why there was an abrupt takeover of the car, meaning that they are, you know, able to also look at these cases and see how to, you know, make them not almost run into a gray vehicle that looks very similar to the color of the asphalt. So that's something we have to think about too. So Brian will get an over-the-air software update that corrects that for next time. So that use case won't happen. But yes, there will always be more. Nothing's perfect.
Just to give you guys a little bit of information on what happened. This was the craziest thing I've ever experienced in my life. So Brian put the vehicle on what's called Mad Max mode, right, for autopilot. It's literally called Mad Max mode. And he said, okay, I'm running, what was it called, the navigation?
Navigator autopilot.
Navigator autopilot, which can take you from through system-to-system interchanges autonomously, right? So we were going 400 south to 285 west. And he said, okay, I want to move the vehicle over one lane, and it's going to do that autonomously because it knows to exit at this ramp or whatever. And the car identified a gap, which was probably about the length of a car, right? Accelerated ahead of the gap, slammed on the brakes, and then dove into that gap. Like literally just turned the wheel and dove in all by itself. And I was holding on for dear life. I couldn't believe this vehicle was doing this on its own. And then it proceeded to not recognize the car in front of us and almost just drove straight into the back of it until he had to hit the brakes and stop it. It was quite interesting.
Yeah, so Andrew said, I don't think it was going to stop. But I said, nope, it sure was not. He said 99.9% of the time, the car is great. The other, 0.1%, it'll kill you. So that's the thing to get in mind. So I know do you have a question? I see there was a question in back, or you wanted to ask a question?
Sure.
All right, let's hear it.
All right, so all the talk about connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, that's great here in Sandy Springs, downtown Atlanta. GDOT just replaced, was it 5 electromechanical controllers in its city just outside of the metro? The technology that we have and we're deploying, how do we get that so that we have connected vehicles in Unadilla out in Moultrie, in the middle of nowhere where there's a traffic light of 2 crossing state routes, and make sure that the cars driving there are talking to that signal. And then also with that, continuing to update those. We're used to asphalt, concrete, steel that lasts for 20 years. Meanwhile, our technology, I tell IT people we're running controllers off of, before we replaced them, 6 megs of RAM, and they all looked at me like they're insane. What?
You replaced them.
But we've replaced them. How do we replace the ones we just replaced in a couple of years when there's something even better?
That's a good question. Ultimately, I see this connected vehicle technology working its way into the controller itself, so it's part of the controller. You know, but again, going back to our goal is to stand up a common platform across the state, that no matter if you're in Unadilla or you're in Sandy Springs, that you're working off the same technology, the same standards that can be taken advantage of, so that what differs are the applications you want to run. That you might want to look at a different application in a rural area in Unadilla than you might more so a traffic management type application here in Sandy Springs. So that goes back to when we did the full wholesale replacement to 2070 controllers a number of years ago. Similar type concept with our signal software. Hey, let's buy enough licenses in the state so that anyone can take advantage of. We want to do the same thing from a connected vehicle perspective as well. Now that gets back to, okay, how do you get connectivity out there? Brian's doing work from a 4G perspective. We can put modems out there now. Ultimately, do we need to get fiber, or does the 5G infrastructure need to build out to run the type of applications that you want to do? We're not sure yet, but we can work towards that. But we want everyone to be on a similar platform, or that's our goal. That's where we want to position ourselves, so that no matter where you are in the state, you can take advantage of it and run a type of application that best meets your needs.
And my comment again from the private sector is that there's a real potential, and this is going to be good and bad, for the private sector to essentially roll over the public sector. And what I mean by that is that the pace of technology deployment will just overwhelm the government's ability to buy assets. And I think that speaks to your point, Tom, is that when you're in the business of buying the technology, then you're worried about, is it going to be long duration and so forth. As the government on the technology side transitions to outcomes-based contracting, the actual cost of the hardware becomes low cost and immaterial. And so what then you end up with these outcomes-based contracts where GDOT will contract with somebody to provide connected vehicle services in these rural areas in accordance with such and such an outcome. And then leave it to the private sector to figure out which radios there are, what the brand is, and how the traffic controllers gets upgraded and how the integration gets done. And so that's a potential solution by moving in the technology space to outcomes-based contracting.
All right, I'm going to stop it there. So last thing, 30 seconds. Where do you see us going in the future?
I see a future where I think what all you folks are seeing, where vehicles are going to get connected. We're going to be assisting drivers to avoiding crashes more and more. We're going to be seeing some level of highly automated vehicle in geofenced areas. So what I think we're seeing is vehicles that are going to be much more sophisticated as part of a transportation network that's likely going to be shared, that'll, I think, have mobility benefits, environmental benefits, and most of all, safety benefits. So I think that that future is going to be upon us here sooner than we think. And I think on the road to that, we're going to be assisting more and more drivers with technology to avoid crashes on the road to connected and automated vehicles.
Brian, I want to hear some solutions, outcomes-based, all this talk. So you tell me where we're going to be in the future.
All right, well, a couple of points. Firstly, the future is better than the past. So I'm an optimist. Awake every day, an optimist, going to change the world. We're going to change the world much more quickly than traditionally we think in the transportation business. And how we're going to do that is by applying the lessons of the two great technology innovations that have changed our world: the internet and cell phones, or smartphones. Those things have changed our worlds in the last 10 years, and we're going to use those technologies and techniques to change the transportation world in the same way in the next decade.
In the future, I see a changing role of the DOT. I think that we are going to transition to be more of an O&M type agency rather than your traditional design and construct, because I think technology is gonna start outpacing how fast we can build a network. I tell the commissioner as often as I can't wait until you feel like you have to move your office to the TMC rather than sitting here in the general office, because that's gonna become our most critical function. I believe it already is, but I think it's only gonna become more critical. So I see in the future DOT's and government's role shifting in terms of how we manage and operate our infrastructure.
With that, here's your president. I'm just gonna let her do some closing remarks.
Thank you guys, we appreciate it. If you guys have any more questions, you might be able to catch them after, if you're able to stay. Perfect. Just a couple of quick announcements. Membership dues are due, so if you haven't paid yet and you're not a member, you have to start paying the non-member rate, and that'll really hit you when conference comes. But our next meeting, our April monthly meeting, will be Wednesday, April 24th at 11:30. We're actually going to have it at the Aviation Community Cultural Center. It's located off Fulton Industrial near the Fulton County Airport, and we're actually going to have a UPS distribution guy. I forget what his name is. So I think his name is Frank. So we will have Frank presenting to us about the UPS regional facility. If you're not sure what that is, UPS just opened up a distribution center right there off of Fulton Industrial. So it should be pretty interesting. Tomorrow night, trivia. Wing Factory in Smyrna at 7. I think Mark said he was going to buy the first round for everyone.
Yeah.
ITS America annual meeting, June 4th to the 7th. That's in Washington, D.C. Go to ITS America online. Hotel and conference registration is open. And lastly, mark your calendars. ITS Georgia, our annual meeting, October 6th through the 8th in Athens. That's going to be a lot of fun. I think we have a brewery tour, and so similar to the Savannah, almost a progressive dinner. So that's what I have planned. So if you're interested in getting involved with that annual meeting, see Chuck Bailey, and he already left. So appreciate y'all. I hope to see you in April, maybe tomorrow night.